Hi, and welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today, we're going to be talking about classification and taxonomy. Classification is really just how we categorize life on the planet. Taxonomy is the study of why we categorize things the way that we do. The study of taxonomy is really just how do we name, classify, and sort organisms? We're organizing organisms. So let's talk about why. Why do we classify things? We classify things because that actually helps humans learn about the world they live in. If I were to call and say excitedly that I have discovered a new species of animal, and it's really, really, I'm going to put it in the same category as an octopus. Automatically that gives you information about it. You know, it probably has tentacles. It probably has little suckers. It probably has a beak. It probably lives in the water. So you already have a ton of information about it just by knowing what it's classified with, what category it falls into. We like to know whether organisms are the same species, whether it's a variant within the species, and that's important to us. So what is a species? A species is a population of organisms. They share similar characteristics. They can interbreed freely and produce fertile offspring. Literally, this means that a population that is able to have babies together and their babies can one day have babies, that's what we consider a species. So far, biologists say that there are about 1.5 million species on the planet. And we still have up to maybe 100 million species that have yet to be identified. Scientific naming, which is a big part of taxonomy, is actually to help us prevent the confusion that comes with common names. So, for instance, this animal that is right next to me might be called a mountain lion or a cougar or a Florida panther. And all of those names are accurate. They're local names, but they don't really tell us exactly which species we're talking about. So 18th century scientists agreed that there needed to be a single system for naming. And they started using Latin names to name organisms. Initially, the naming system was sort of crazy. You could actually have 14 to 20 names to describe one organism. And so the guy, Carolus Linnaeus, in the 1700s, actually created the naming system that we still use. We call it binomial nomenclature. And binomial just means two names. Nomenclature means naming system. So binomial nomenclature, our two-name naming system. Linnaeus' system was based on levels of classification so that each organism actually has a scientific name that is written in a specific way and has two names. Here are the rules for binomial nomenclature. Usually, we're going to underline the name or we're going to put it in italics. The genus is listed first with a capital letter. The species is second, and it's lowercase. Now, these are actually levels of classification, and we're going to learn about those levels of classification in a minute. But for right now, you just need to know that the genus is a level of classification, and it's always going to come first, and it's going to have a capital letter at the beginning. The species name will come second, and it's always going to be lowercase. As long as you follow those rules, you will write your scientific names correctly. This slide is just showing you what we see. So for instance, the grizzly bear, that's its common name, just like polar bear is a common name. However, the names of each of these bears are Ursidae, Ursus arctos, or Ursus arctos is the scientific name. For the polar bear, it's Ursus maritimus. For the black bear, it's Ursus americanus, and so on and so forth. And so they're all part of that Ursus genus, which means that they're all fairly closely related with individual species names. If you look down a little lower, panda bears and sloth bears, which are not as closely related as the other types of bears on this list, have a different genus name for each of them, which means they're not as closely related. And truthfully, they're not the same type of bear. But they are all in the same family, which is Ursidae. Here's an example of some levels of classification that we might find for various organisms. So you see the human there and all of our levels of classification from domain to species. And I know I haven't taught those to you yet. You're about to learn them. Common chimpanzee, we share a lot of levels of classification with the chimpanzee. So this statement is very, very important. You are more closely related to organisms the more levels of classification you share. So we actually share all from domain all the way through family with chimpanzees. That means we're fairly closely related. We're not as closely related to the gray wolf. We only share domain through class. So if you kind of look at this, you see the more closely related the organisms are, the more levels of classification they share. Finally, here is Linnaeus' system. So there are 8 levels of classification. We start with domain. It's the largest, the broadest. We actually only have 3 domains at all. Domain Eukarya, domain Archaea, and domain Bacteria. The domains get split up into kingdoms. Kingdoms are split into phyla. The phyla are split into classes. Classes are split into orders. Orders into families. And then finally, families are split up into genuses and genuses into species. Genus and species are where we're getting our scientific names from that I hopefully you wrote down the rules for so that you can do scientific naming on your own. You must memorize these levels of classification and you must memorize them in order. You need to know domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Come up with some sort of mnemonic device so that you can remember it, like Dumb King Philip came over for gas station sushi. Whatever helps you remember it. Just make sure that you know it. The more general, more broad the category, the less the characteristics have in common, the more diverse the group of organisms will be. The more specific, they are actually going to be less diverse. They'll have more characteristics in common. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. Make sure you memorize these. I like to show this one for those that the pyramid didn't make any sense. Just take a look at this. So if we start at the bottom, and I know it starts with kingdom instead of domain. Domain actually hasn't been used as long as the others. So domain was something that we added. Linnaeus actually started with kingdom. But if you look at it, how the kingdom is going to get split into phyla, and the phyla get split into classes into orders, and so on and so forth. And this actually gives you the classification of humans. We're in the kingdom Animalia. We're chordates. That means we have a backbone. We're mammals. That means we have fur or hair, and we can produce milk for our young. We're primates. We have collarbones and grasping fingers. We're hominids. That means our faces are relatively flat, and we have 3-dimensional vision. Homo, these are hominids with upright posture and big brains. The only other Homo genus out there are actually early humans that are, those species have gone extinct and have kind of become us. And finally, our species is sapiens. So we're actually Homo sapiens. Genus is Homo, with sapien being our species name. And that just perfectly describes us. As you go through, every living thing on the planet has a classification similar to this. They have a domain, they have kingdoms, they have a phylum, they have a class, they have an order, a family, a genus, and a species name. And all of it is based on the characteristics they share. To drive this point home, this is the final example of this that I'm going to share. If you take a look at these organisms, and we are classifying a grizzly bear, right? I want to know what's more closely related to a grizzly bear, the red fox or the coral snake. Well, you probably would think of it and you're like, well, the fox and the bear, I mean, they're both mammals and carnivores, so they're probably more closely related than it would be to the snake, which isn't a mammal. And you would be right. But again, it's based on these characteristics. So if you look at the grizzly bear, it shares the level of classification, it shares those through the order with the fox. So they are both in kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and order Carnivora, which means that both foxes and grizzly bears are animals with backbones that produce milk for their young, are covered in fur or hair, and in this case, both of them consume meat. If we look at the coral snake, it's also an animal and it also has a backbone, but that's where the similarities between it and the bear stop. The really cool thing about these levels of classification is how we come up with them, how we put organisms into different levels. When Linnaeus created his system, he was actually grouping organisms based on physical similarities. And when he looked at these physical similarities of these organisms, he was able to place them into categories. And to be perfectly honest, Linnaeus was really good at it. I've always kind of suspected maybe he was a little OCD, but he was very, very good at categorizing organisms based on their characteristics. When Darwin came along and he created his concept of descent with modification, natural selection, and evolutionary relationships, we actually changed how we grouped organisms. We started grouping them by phylogeny. We started saying that organisms should be categorized based on those that they are more closely related to evolutionarily. Here's the really cool part. Our system didn't have to change. Linnaeus had done such an amazing job grouping organisms based on characteristics that what we discovered is that those characteristics really were also describing evolutionary relationships. Now, obviously, there were a couple of things that had to change. For instance, the elephant shrew initially was categorized with rodents. It actually belonged closer to the pachyderms. It belonged closer to elephants, which was somewhat surprising. But again, that was based on DNA, based on that molecular evidence, based on characteristics, and also based on embryology and things like that. So phylogeny now plays a role. Those phylogenetic trees literally set us up for our classification system. You guys have already discussed cladograms. Cladograms are just these phylogenetic trees. It shows evolutionary relationships among a group of organisms. So if you look at this cladogram that we have here, where you see the little dots, that's where it's indicating there is some sort of characteristic or trait. So all three of these organisms are have tiny free-swimming larvae. That is a characteristic all three share. But as you move up the cladogram or to the ends of the cladogram, the limpet doesn't have the molted exoskeleton that the crab and the barnacle do, which means that crabs and barnacles actually are more closely related than the barnacle is to the limpet, despite the fact that limpets and barnacles look more alike. It's based on the characteristics that they have. In addition, we can look at other evidence for their evolutionary history and see that crabs and barnacles are actually more closely related through evolution. So these branching trees that we call cladograms are going to show not only the characteristics that organisms have, but it's also going to show where they have common ancestors. Just like evidence of evolution, we are using these same characteristics to help determine classification. We look at similarities in the DNA, and that can help us determine the locations where organisms belong according to our classification system. Many organisms share important similarities at the molecular level. In fact, there's some DNA that just does eukaryote stuff. For instance, we share half our DNA with bananas. Obviously, other than the fact that my students are very appealing, bananas and humans don't seem to have a whole lot in common. That's why we only share 50% of our DNA. That 50% that we share, it's really based on things like how do you make a cell membrane, and how do you make a mitochondria? How do you do these particular processes? All those proteins that are necessary to create are found in DNA, just like us. So bananas and humans do share 50% of their DNA, but we're not as closely related to bananas, obviously, as we are to bonobos, where we share 98.7% of our DNA. So understanding the similarities in the DNA can help us determine evolutionary relationships. Obviously, when we're more closely related, we have a more recent common ancestor with bonobos than we do with bananas. The other cool thing that we can do with molecular evidence is we can actually create molecular clocks. This is essentially changes in the DNA marking evolutionary time. So we know the rate at which mutations accumulate in DNA in specific segments. Coding sections of DNA that are genes, we actually see those changing a lot slower than in non-coding sections of DNA, which kind of makes sense. Changes in the coding section of the DNA might change the gene, which could actually prevent the organism with the mutation from surviving. Therefore, mutation won't get passed on. So it definitely doesn't change as often as sections that don't do anything, that don't create proteins. So we can actually use that to determine how long it's been since an organism shared a common ancestor with another organism. This thing right here is what we refer to as a dichotomous key. Dichotomous keys help us identify organisms. And you guys are going to get a chance to do a dichotomous key in class. We're actually going to use a dichotomous key to identify jelly beans. So if you take a look at these birds, we're going to try to identify bird X, right? So to do a dichotomous key, we're always going to start at number 1, and I'm going to use my pointer to show that to you. So we always start at number 1, and we have a paired statement. The beak is relatively long and slender. The beak is relatively stout and heavy. If we look at this bird, its beak seems stout and heavy. It's definitely not long and slender. So we are going to go to statement 2. So you just follow the directions. So statement 2 says the bottom surface of the lower beak is flat and straight, or the bottom surface of the lower beak is curved. So if I take a look at this one, the bottom surface of our lower beak, it's curved. That's the bottom surface, and it's curved. So I follow the directions. Go to 3. The lower edge of the upper beak has a distinct bend, or the lower edge of the upper beak is mostly flat. So if I look at this bird, the lower edge of the upper beak seems pretty flat to me. It definitely doesn't have a bend. So bird X is a platyspiza. If I wanted to do a different bird, for instance, I would say the beak, let's say bird Y. Again, we go back to number 1, start with A and B. The beak is relatively long and slender, or the beak is relatively stout and heavy. Well, it's long and slender. So in this case, this is the name of our bird, Certhidea. Sorry, I am really struggling to pronounce that today. But this is the name of our bird. The great thing about our system is that it changes, it grows with us. As we learn more, we can actually adjust our classification system and our taxonomy so that it can include all living things. So as organisms are discovered, we put them into new classification levels, or we add them to the classification level where they're supposed to be. Used to be, we didn't have any domains, and we only had 5 kingdoms. We actually had all bacteria in one kingdom called Monera. But as we learned more about bacteria, we realized there's actually 2 types of bacteria, and we really needed to separate them out because one type of bacteria is more closely related to us than the other type. So we actually now have domains. We have eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. This aspect of our classification system really lends itself to the nature of science. When we talk about the different domains and the different kingdoms in our classification system, this is what we're really talking about. And I like this diagram. It really shows how everything's sort of related. So make sure that you copy this down. It also gives you a couple of the pieces of information that you're going to need. We're going to add a little bit more to it a little bit later, but for right now, this is kind of important information. In a previous video, we've already talked about the bacteria domains. I'm just going to very quickly go through this. So domain bacteria, or kingdom eubacteria, again, these are prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. They do have a cell wall, and it's made with a molecule called peptidoglycan. They could be autotrophs or heterotrophs. And just a quick reminder, autotrophs are individuals that are able to create food for energy. Heterotrophs need to consume food for energy. Some examples: E. coli, tuberculosis, strep throat. All of these fall under the eubacteria kingdom. Domain archaea are going to be our extreme prokaryotes. Again, they're prokaryotic, they're unicellular. The kingdom is archaea bacteria, and these guys are extremophiles. They thrive in extreme conditions. So understanding that archaea is completely different than regular bacteria is really the first step to understanding why we have those two domains. In addition, with domain archaea, these are ancient bacteria, and they are actually more closely related genetically to eukaryotes than they are to the other bacteria, the eubacteria. This slide is the start of domain eukarya, which is really anything that's a eukaryote. The first kingdom we talk about is kingdom Protista, which is really actually several kingdoms, but don't worry about that for right now. We refer to this as the junk drawer kingdom. If it's not a plant, an animal, or a fungus, it's probably a protist. They reproduce sexually or asexually. They might be heterotrophic. They might be autotrophic. We actually have some that are both. They can do both at the same time. Most of them are unicellular. Some of them are multicellular. And the example I've given you here, that's actually an amoeba. But paramecium, amoebas, seaweed, those are all examples of protist. Fungi, our fourth kingdom we're going to talk about, are heterotrophs. They are going to feed on decaying or dead materials. They are decomposers. They feed by releasing digestive enzymes and then absorbing the nutrients and the sugars. They have cell walls on their cells, but they're made of chitin instead of like the peptidoglycan that we see in the cell walls of bacteria. The most important thing to take away from this is fungi do not do photosynthesis. They are heterotrophs. They're saprophytes. They have to feed on other organisms. Last two kingdoms are Plantae and Animalia. Plantae are just the plant kingdom. Again, these are both still in domain eukarya. Plants are multicellular. They're photosynthetic, which means they're autotrophs, and they're usually sessile. Plants aren't really big on getting up and walking around. They also have cell walls that are made with cellulose. So that's three different materials that can make up cell walls that we've discussed. Animalia, these are all the animals, and this is actually us. This is where we are classified. They're multicellular, they're heterotrophic. That means these organisms must consume food, and they do not have cell walls. Animals are all modal, which means at some point in their life cycle, they're able to move. Even sponges that normally spend their life sort of attached to the sea floor, as larvae are able to free swim. So all of these characteristics are important identifiers for kingdom Animalia. So this is just a reference for you. Use this as an opportunity to compare and contrast the classification of living things. This is a majority of the important information. Truthfully, if you take the time to write this down, it would be really beneficial for you. This just gives you all of the kingdoms and how they compare to one another, as well as telling you which domain they belong in. And this is our final slide. So this is a phylogenetic tree showing evolutionary relationships. Of course, the closer the two organisms are on the tree, the more closely related they are. And if you take a look, this phylogenetic tree is really showing you the domains. So if you start at the bottom, what you'll notice is that bacteria and eukarya split with archaea sort of evolving along the way. So we are more closely related to that archaea bacteria than we are to eubacteria. In addition, you can also see that animals and fungi are more closely related than we are to some other organisms. And that's actually kind of an interesting dynamic. So this is the phylogenetic tree of life. Obviously, you don't need to know all these names on here. It's just to give you the big picture. This is how organisms evolved over time. As always, thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time.